So, good evening, and thank you everyone for joining us, and welcome to tonight's Heritage Hour. We are very grateful that you've chosen to spend your time with us tonight. So, my name is Nicole Solis. I am the Archivist Supervisor at the Lambton County Archives, and I will be both a moderator and presenter for tonight's Heritage Hour titled Legends of Lambton. Over the next hour, we're going to hear stories about fascinating people from our local history. Many iconic individuals have called Lambton County their home, and this includes the lesser-known stories of famous or infamous characters that have helped shape our county into the community it is today. If you're interested in viewing our previous Heritage Hours, you can access them online at www.heritagelambton.ca. We are also recording tonight's presentation, so if you want to watch it again or share it with family and friends, you can. We'll send an email blast with the link to everyone registered when the video is publicly available. You can use the chat box to make comments and talk with other attendees. Just be sure you are sending your messages to all attendees and not just panelists. The chat has already started off, but if you want to join in, you can start by sharing where you're joining us from tonight. Also, if you have a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or type it into the chat. We'll answer the questions after all of our panelists have shared their presentations. With me are 4 representatives from the Heritage Sarnia Lambton Museum Network for our last Heritage Hour of 2024. I'll introduce each presenter as we go, and we'll finish up the evening with some community museum updates as well as the Q&A. So to start off is Professor Greg Stott. Greg currently teaches history at University College of the North out of Thompson, Manitoba. He grew up in Arkona and has published studies on Arkona, Port Franks, and Whittier. Greg, thanks for joining us tonight, and I will stop sharing so you can go ahead and start sharing yours.
Thank you. Can everyone see that? All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to be talking about a fairly obscure Lambton County resident who I've become quite fascinated with over the many years. And this is the poet and poetess who lived from roughly 1811, 1812. I'm not exactly sure of his birth date till his death in 1895. I think he's a very colorful character. He's an individual that I find fascinating to read about. I'm not sure he's someone I would want to know personally, though, for reasons that I will allude to in this discussion. On the 2nd of January, 1856, the Court of General Quarterly Sessions of the Lambton County Court met at the Sarnia Courthouse, which is pictured on this slide, before His Honor Judge Charles Robinson, assisted by W.E. Wright, Alfred Fisher, and Froom Telford. The 5th case brought before the county court was an action of tort brought against Port Frank's merchant and postmaster, Robert McBride, by Whittier-based merchant Robert Ray. The case of Ray versus McBride received only a modicum of coverage in the local press, and like many other similar cases of the day, it faded from public consciousness very quickly. It did not, however, fade from the memory and the life story of McBride. And he made many claims that he had faced a great deal of, he'd been a victim of injustice. And in fact, he took it on as his mission to try and shine light corners, and he complained that the colonial government, the administration of the United Province of Canada, the judicial system, the land system, and so forth, were highly corrupt, and that there was too much self-interest involved, and that he happened to be one of these victims of this political intrigue. And he said that it was sending the best people of the Canadas were ultimately leaving because of this corruption and heading for greener pastures in the United States. And he wanted to correct this. McBride was born a Protestant Irishman in Ardstraw in the County Tyrone in Ireland, late 1811 or early 1812. Following the death of his father, McBride secured a position as a seal master of or inspector of linens in Strawbane Linen Hall, which he held for 6 years. He then migrated to British North America, landing in Hamilton and then living for a time in Haldimand County before removing to Lambton County or Port Franks in the early 1850s. He's involved in a bit of a Port-Francs. I won't get into the details, but Port-Francs had a very dubious beginning. It was part of an ongoing power struggle within the Canada Company, and McBride saw himself as partially a victim of this. He very quickly secured the office of postmaster in Port-Francs due to the powerful politician Malcolm Cameron, who helped secure the office for him. And Malcolm Cameron, and this is the way politics was done in the 19th century, there was an expectation of quid pro quo. I have landed you this important office, and the expectation is that you will support me come election time. Uh, Electioneering in the mid 1850s, if we think it's dirty business in the mid early 21st century, it was rather interesting. This is before, of course, the secret ballot. All votes were public. You would raise your hand at a public polling station, so everyone would know how you voted. The fact that Cameron expected him to support him, and sort of as a matter of principle, he refused. And he very quickly became involved in a controversy over a boat. Um, about the 1st of May, 1855, McBride, who was a merchant and postmaster, purchased a boat from Abraham Goyster. He thought he had bought it free and clear. However, shortly after he purchased it, he was confronted by Robert Ray of Witter, who said that he had purchased the same boat earlier and that he had title to it and that McBride had no claim to this. McBride absolutely refused and said, this is preposterous. I bought the boat free and clear. And as he's a poet, so he writes in his later poetic rendering of this, he says, quote, "These rascals all I knew them well, see how they work their magic spell. I bought the boat and paid them cash. How dare they send me such trash?" And this is his summons to court. He utterly refuses, and as I said, he appears ultimately in November of 1855. The court case is held over, and then again he appears on January the 2nd, 1856. The court case does not go well for him, and in fact, ultimately, he later he was represented by his lawyer was William Penrose Vidal of Sarnia, and if he in his poetic he creates a play about this. He was trying to emulate Shakespeare. He used names for all the characters. He's not I think he was not fond of his lawyer because in the play he refers to him as Mr. Simple. But Judge Charles Robinson, he later christened as Judge Blunderbrains, and he will write out the entire court case, etc., in poetic version. In fact, he says of Judge Blunderbrains, he is also active in business with those who are named Catchpole and Cheatham. So he certainly has he's not fond of these individuals. Unfortunately, as I said, the judgment went against him. He believes Malcolm Cameron deliberately intervened in the process, and in fact, that there was a cabal against him. His business records had been submitted as evidence and then were never returned to him. He was found at fault. He was supposed to repay costs and damages. He could not, apparently, he had no records to prove debts owed to him. And as a result, he was thrown into debtor's prison in Sarnia for 2 and 3 years, 2 or 3 year sentences. He was ruined as a businessman. Ultimately, he was let go from prison, and he briefly taught school in Warwick Township before being lured to Oil Springs, where he seems to have engaged in the oil business very briefly, and then also as a merchant, and ultimately he became a beekeeper. He never forgets what happened to him in the mid 1850s, and he is confronted by a number of tragedies in his life. He was widowed twice. He lost both of his wives and a young daughter, and then shortly after relocating to Oil Springs, his eldest son died of typhoid fever. McBride wrote voraciously, and he has 2 published works. He was an Orangeman, so he was vehemently anti-Catholic. Unsavory in would make him very unsavory in our times. But his first publication was the Canadian Orange Minstrel, which came out in 1860, and it, of course, is a celebration of Protestantism and a denigration of Catholicism, which is part of his spiel. His largest work is, and I'm not going to read you in the entire title, you can see it here. It is one of the longest titles, I think, of a book ever published about Lambton County, and it comes out in 1869. And in this, he publishes poems on all kinds of things. It's 300 and some odd pages. I have my own copy of the original. It's extraordinarily fragile. But he also includes in it a very lengthy poetic play about the crimes and misdemeanors that he felt he was a victim of. So he was later celebrated. He's referenced a couple of times in the 1880s in the Sarnia Observer as the great poet. And he may also have, there's some indication he may have also sung some of his poems. I don't know whether he was a good singer or not, but he had some local notoriety. Um, so he gained some local fame and possibly infamy. And I think census takers may have found him extremely problematic because woe betide the poor man who came along to take the census in Oil Springs in 1871. Here's the entry for the McBride household, Robert and his surviving son. You can't quite see here under occupation. I'll show you. This is what the census to write in there. Most say farmer, merchant, etc. He has poet, writing poems and songs and all the evil and good transpiring in Canada. So I imagine him telling the census, no, take this down, not just poet. And so he wrote this very detailed indication of his attitudes and ideas. He died on the 7th of November, 1895. I presume he's buried in Oil Springs, but as far as I know, there is no marker for him. If you're interested in further information on McBride, I'm not trying to blow my own horn, but I've studied him in a couple of different articles. So there's an article devoted specifically to him, poetic justice, and his examination of the corruption, as well as an article on Port Franks, both of which are published in Ontario History. So he's an interesting person, and poems, we don't think of those as sources for history, but in this case, I think it's an interesting venue, and it's a poem. It's not necessarily a good play. I'm not necessarily a good judge of the English language, but I think it's perhaps not the greatest of plays, but I think it's an interesting foray into a man trying to, who felt he'd been wronged and was trying to be political and an advocate for himself, people who faced similar injustices. So that is the end of my presentation.
Excellent, Greg. Thank you so much for sharing its story. So Erin D. Richard, the curator supervisor of the Oil Museum of Canada, she's usually part of these heritage hours, but she was unable to be here in person tonight. However, she was eager to also to stay involved by sharing stories of legends that came from Lambton County's oil fields. So I will read some of these throughout the course of the evening. And to start this, we're going to talk about James Miller Williams, a Welsh American who emigrated to British North America in the 1840s with his family. Starting out as a wagon maker in Hamilton, Ontario, he became interested in petroleum in the 1850s, taking ownership of the International Mining and Manufacturing Company after it failed financially. Few people knew much about petroleum or its supply, demand, and uses, or even whether or not oil could become the foundation for a viable industry. After hand digging the first commercial oil well of North America, Williams quickly fashioned a fully integrated petroleum corporation exploring, recovering, transporting, refining, and marketing oil. So now, with that story in tow, couple stories in tow now, we are going to hear from Dana Thorne. Dana is the curator supervisor at Lambton Heritage Museum and has held that position since 2018. Dana's been working at cultural facilities in the county of Lambton for over 10 years, first as an intern at the Oil Museum of Canada and then as the archivist at the Lambton County Archives. She completed her BA in History at the University of Alberta and her MA in Public History at Western University. Dana is passionate about telling our local stories and engaging the community in our history. Take it away, Dana.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Just give me a moment to share my screen. Okay, So, since Lambton Heritage Museum's mandate is to collect artifacts related to the history of the entire county of Lambton, I had free rein to highlight any local legends that struck my fancy. I decided to go with a rock and roll star, an astronaut, and a celebrated local photographer. So, did you know that rock and roll icon Kim Mitchell grew up in Sarnia? On this slide, you can see him in his 1980s glory and his portrait from his 1970 high school yearbook. Joseph Kim Mitchell was born in Sarnia on July 10th, 1952. He attended St. Clair Secondary School. One of Mitchell's first bands was called The Quotations. He was only 13 years old when they formed the group. This picture was taken when the band played a gig at the Sarnia Yacht Club. Like many of their early shows, they didn't get paid. However, drummer Brian McClellan told me that they did get a free boat ride down the St. Clair River. McClellan attended one of our show and tell events that Lambton Museums and Libraries hosted this past year. These events were a chance for members of the public to share photographs and artifacts from our local history. If you want to hear the full interview, I'll post the link to the chat when I'm done. Mitchell was 14 years old when his next band, the Grass Company, was formed. It included members from the Quotations and another local band, Unit 4. The Windsor Star ran this article on May 20th, 1967, that proclaimed the Grass Company was Sarnia's answer to the Beatles. You can see Mitchell holding a guitar in the middle image from the newspaper clipping. The reporter noted, the swinging Sarnia combo, the Grass Company, could go big time almost any time, but school studies must come first. The article also included this note about practice time at the Mitchell household. The company gives out at practice time to such a point that Mrs. Mitchell has to straighten out pictures in the living room upstairs or china in the china cabinet. Does she mind it? Not really, for we know where the boys are and we know they have a good, clean, healthy love of music. The Grass Company started off playing local arena high schools and the weekly record hops at the legendary Rose Gardens roller rink. One of the items that Brian McClellan shared with me at our show and tell was his copy of the Grass Company's record, which featured 2 original songs written by Jim Chevalier. It was recorded in New Haven, Michigan. McClellan recalled that they had 200 or 300 copies of the 45 loaded in their band when they were driving back to Sarnia. At the border, the customs official insisted that they pay duty on the records. But because the boys had spent all their money on the recording, they couldn't afford the duty and they had to abandon almost all of the copies at the border. And can you see the Sharpie marks on one side of the record here? This is actually a correction because there was a misprint by the record company. One of the songs was called Days and the other song was called Once a Child, but the record company actually misprinted Once a Days instead of Days. In Sarnia's rock and roll scene in the late 1960s, bands would often help each other out. In these pictures, Kim Mitchell stepped up to support fellow rockers, the Volcanoes, for a gig on Christina Street. The Volcanoes landed on the charts with their single Sympathize shortly before the Grass Company cut their record in New Haven. I love this picture of the Grass Company because they picked the Blue Water Bridge as the backdrop for their photo shoot. After the Grass Company broke up, Mitchell went on to form the band Max Webster with fellow Sarnia native Pi Dubois. Max Webster toured extensively and built a catalog of hits. In 1982, Mitchell embarked on a solo career. The 1985 song Go for a Soda was an international hit. Others followed, including Patio Lanterns and Rock and Roll Duty. He was inducted into the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame in 2020. Mitchell continues to tour. He jokes about his status as one of Canada's rock geezers, or as he cheekily calls himself, a heritage artist. You can visit our Lambton Gallery here at Lambton Heritage Museum to see some Kim Mitchell-related items, including a ticket stub, a concert pick, a backstage pass, and a patio lantern, which was stolen from a local bar so that it could be signed by Mitchell when he was in town for a concert. My next legend of Lambton is Chris Hadfield. A retired astronaut, Hadfield flew 2 space shuttle missions and served as commander of the International Space Station. He was a fighter pilot in the Canadian military before he was accepted into the Canadian Space Agency astronaut program in 1992. There were over 5,300 applicants, and only 4 of them were selected. Hadfield was not only a brilliant astronaut, but also a charismatic and creative presence and an amazing advocate for the space program. He filmed interesting experiments in space for school children and tweeted about his extraterrestrial activities. He even made the first music video in space, which appropriately was a cover of David Bowie's Space Oddity. So what's our local connection to Chris Hadfield? Well, he was born in Sarnia on August 29th, 1959, but he grew up on a farm near Milton. Even though they moved when Hadfield was young, the family cottage was located at Stag Island, and the family spent a lot of time there. This was where Chris Hadfield knew with absolute clarity that he wanted to become an astronaut. It happened late in the evening on July 20th, 1969. Hadfield trekked with his family to a neighbor's cottage, one of the few places on Stag Island with a television set. He joined an excited group of cottagers to watch the historic moon landing. After Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, Hadfield went outside and gazed up into a summer sky where the moon was shining. That was when he decided to become an astronaut. Hadfield shared more about his summers at the cottage in the book Stag Island Yesterday and Today. We watered, skied mornings, dodged odd jobs, snuck off to canoe, swim, ski, and play all day long, and slept in a screened tent on camp chairs at night. The blue water, warm sun, canals, and sand provided endless variety and adventure. Hadfield wrote a children's book about his moment of inspiration on Stag Island called The Darkest Dark. If you're looking for an excellent Christmas present for any of the little people in your life, we have copies for sale in the gift shop at Lambton Heritage Museum. My final legend of Lambton is not as flashy a name as Chris Hadfield or Kim Mitchell, but he's a legend in the heritage community. Louis James Pesch's photographs are some of the most enduring images of Lambton County villages and towns. Pesch was born on August 11th, 1868 in Euphemia Township near the hamlet of Shetland in southeastern Lambton County. He spent the early years of his life farming, but when he was about 25 years old, Pesha embarked on a new career. We don't know how Pesha learned the art of photography, but he probably completed an apprenticeship with a local photographer. It's how a lot of photographers were trained in the late 1800s. In the 1901 census, Pesha was living in Oil Springs with his wife, Lena, and his occupation was listed as photographer. Pesha's earliest work was in portrait photography, and he had studios in Oil Springs, Inwood, Alvinston, and Brigden. But he found his great success not in photographing people, but in capturing our built environment. Pesha photographed villages and towns, capturing public buildings like schools, churches, and railway stations. Pesha also photographed many of the vessels that sailed on Lake Huron and the St. Clair River. It's estimated that the prolific Pesha produced 7,000 photographs of cities and towns and 1,500 marine images. A talented photographer, Pesha's images are known for being crisp and clear. He often worked early in the evening or the morning or late in the evening, ensuring he captured the sights when the streets were not full of people. Those folks walking around town could easily appear as blurs in the days of long exposure times for photographs. Pesha's main business was printing photographs on picture postcards. Postcards with pictures or artwork became very popular in the 1890s. As transportation options improved, more people were traveling and wanted to collect souvenirs as they went. Postcards were also an easy and convenient form of communication when people wanted to send a quick note or an update. They were also very affordable. Pesha left Lambton County in 1901 when his Brigden photography studio was destroyed by fire. He moved to Marine City, Michigan, where he opened up the Pesha Art Company. That's when he began to focus on postcard photography, and most of his work was completed between 1908 and 1912. Unfortunately, Pesha was driving near his father's home in Euphemia Township on October 2nd, 1912, when a car accident claimed his life. It was reported that Mr. Pesha, who was driving the vehicle, pulled the wrong lever, and with a rush, the car backed up and went over a 15-foot embankment, turning completely over. Mr. Pesha was dead when removed from under the car. He was only 44 years old when he died. These days, original Pesha photographs are highly sought after by historians and collectors, not only because of the quality of his photography, but because he captured so many wonderful streetscapes, public buildings, and marine vessels. Pesha's body of work is a wonderful snapshot back in time. And that's it for me tonight. Thank you very much.
That's so interesting, Dana. Thank you for sharing those stories. So our next oil field legend I'm going to briefly share is William Henry McGarvey, a hard oiler who owned a general store in Petrolia where he was elected mayor and served a term as county warden. He took up an interest in petroleum and learned the trade as an operator, refiner, and oil inland industry leader. He traveled to Galicia, or modern-day Poland and Ukraine, where he and his business partner Bergheim would strike it rich, and McGarvey would become known as the Petroleum King of Austria. Many Lambton hard oilers would join McGarvey abroad, working in his oil fields before they were seized during the First World War. Most of the oil field and refinery managers were in fact Canadians, men known to McGarvey from his days in Petrolia and Oil Springs. McGarvey rubbed shoulders with actual royalty, and his youngest daughter even married the German Count Ebert Friedrich Alexander Joseph Edward Graf von Zeppelin, nephew of the inventor of the Zeppelin rigid airships. You can learn more about McGarvey through the book Crude Genius, The Making of an International Oil Baron by Gary May, which is also available for purchase at the Oil Museum gift shop. So next up is Kaylin Shepley, the curator at Sombra Museum. She has been in that position since 2017. Her educational background is in languages and history, and she is currently completing a program in museum studies. Last year, Kaylin co-authored her first children's book based on experiences at Sombra Museum. You can take the floor, Kaylin.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm having a little trouble with my camera, so I'll start my video. I don't know if you can see me or not.
I do not.
Okay. I will just leave it with my name. Okay, so I will share my screen. Here. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, so tonight I will be speaking about Maud Dalgetty. She was one of the founders of Sombra Museum. When it comes to legends of Lambton and Sombra, there were so many choices. We had John S. Burnham, who built most of Sombra Village and was one of the earlier settlers. We've had Mrs. Maud Menton, who was a well-known chemist from Port Lambton, and we've had the Smith family. Many of them were early settlers in Sombra and important people in Lambton County's history. But I chose Maud. She was born Eula Maud Alma Dio on December 13th, 1906, on Lot 14, Concession 7 at Beecher. To her parents, Robert Orser Dio and Ellen Minerva Smith. And Ellen herself was the granddaughter of Andrew Smith, who is related to the first Smith settlers of Sombra Township. So in her early childhood, she attended school near Beecher and then eventually went to normal school, which was Teachers College in the day. And she was a teacher until her marriage. In the census of 1931, it says at age 24, as of June 1st, 1931, she was a lodger in Wallaceburg, Ontario at 67 University Street, and her occupation was listed as public school. So she was teaching in Wallaceburg at the time. And then in 1935, there is an interesting document I found online. It's letters asking that she be allowed to substitute teach. They had to write to the Indian agent and the federal government to allow her to be invited to teach at Walpole Island in school number 1, the junior room, from January through June 1935 to take the place of Mrs. Daly, who was on leave. So she taught there. She also taught after her marriage. She stopped teaching and then went back to teaching in the 1950s, I believe, late 1950s. She taught at the Bethel School, which was at the corner of now Bent Path Line and Highway 40, and then moved to Riverview Central School when that opened in 1964. And she most often taught grade 1 and 2. Personally, many people in town have talked about her being their teacher and how she was a strict teacher, but they learned much from her. So she married Morgan Stoughton Dalgetty on October 1st, 1933, and I like to read their wedding announcement from the newspaper because it's very, very detailed. It paints a picture of the occasion. So, in the presence of about 35 guests, a pretty wedding took place recently at the home of Mrs. Ellen Dio and the late Mr. Robert Dio in Beecher, when their youngest daughter, Eula Maud, was united in marriage to Mr. Morgan Stufton Dalgetty, the youngest son of Mrs. E. Dalgetty and the late Mr. Gordon Dalgetty of Sombra. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Wesley Moores, assisted by the Reverend Cuthbert McRitchie, who, as a side note, was a Sombra resident who served during the World War II, who was then of Onondaga, before a bank of autumn leaves and flowers. The bride, who was given in marriage by her brother, Mr. Estio of Sarnia, wore a beautiful wedding dress of ivory satin and lace with a bandeau of orange blossoms and carried a bouquet of talisman roses. The matron of honor, Mrs. James Daly, wore pink georgette and lace and carried a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums. The groomsman was Mr. James W. Daly, and the wedding music was played by Miss Lilith Smith, who wore a dress of green crepe romaine. After the ceremony, a buffet luncheon was served, the table covered with a lace cloth and centered with a wedding cake. Miss Ione Bowles, Miss Elma Bowles, Miss Laura Miller of Detroit, and Mrs. Wesley Arnold served. The bridegroom's mother was attired in an ensemble of black and white crepe, and the bride's mother wore black georgette with lace. Later, Mr. and Mrs. Dalgetty left for Goderich and Northern Points, the bride traveling in a dress of guardsman blue, georgette, and navy coat trimmed with gray fox, and shoes and hat to match. Upon their return, Mr. and Mrs. Dalgetty will reside at Sombra. The bride is a former president of the Trinity United Church Young People Society in Wallaceburg. So as you can tell, they had a somewhat small ceremony, but the description was very detailed. It sounds like a lovely fall wedding. So after they were married, they had 3 children, Lowell, Carol, and Ariel, and they resided in Sombra at the Stover home. It was built as a model home by the Green and Stover Brick Company, who manufactured their own bricks in Sombra. So they lived there. The home is still referred to as the Dalgetty home, and many people use it as a landmark. It happens to be across the street on St. Clair Parkway from Sombra Museum. So after marrying and becoming a teacher, she was very community-minded and decided to get involved with the foundation of the Sombra Historical Society. They formed in 1957 and had their first planning meeting for a museum on November 25th of that year. Maud was the secretary of the Historical Society, and she worked tirelessly, campaigning door to door, doing multiple fundraisers, writing letters to government officials and locals, asking for donations and grants, and explaining the reasoning why the history of Sombra Township should be preserved. In 1959, in June, the museum finally opened, had an official ceremony on the 19th of June of that year, and Maud was there right along for the whole ride. As the secretary of the Historical Society, she wasn't in charge of the museum, but spent a lot of time there, and she donated hundreds upon hundreds of artifacts, ranging from school books and storybooks to photo albums. There was an ivory-handled sword. We've got dishes, furs, and her final donation was actually a postmortem donation from her family in 1997. July of 97 to be precise, of a wedding gown and a twisted glass cane, which I'll speak of a little bit later. Her many accomplishments in getting Sombra Museum up and running culminated in 1984 at the bicentennial of the province of Ontario, when she completed a book, A History of Sombra Township. That was to celebrate the bicentennial, and it's an excellent read. It has everything from political history to the history of all the towns and communities in Sombra, the industries, some of the people, politicians. It talks about the building of the Darcy McKeough Dam. It's a very comprehensive history, and although it is 40 years old this year, it is still actually one of our best sellers in the gift shop, and people often consult it for all manner of research. Also in 1984, she received the Ontario Bicentennial Medal for Community Service. for her many years of contribution to the history and preservation of not only Sombra Township, but the Wallaceburg area. Uh, and she, although at that age, by this time, she was beginning to age, but still contributed to the Historical Society. She passed away in 1996 at the age of 90, leaving behind her children, Lowell, Carol, and Ariel. Her family of note, though, the Dalgettys owned the Sombra Ferry. Her husband bought the business and had a business partner with the Deans, and eventually her son Lowell took over, and then his son and his son had ran the ferry until 2018. As well, her daughter Ariel married Al Mann from Wallaceburg, who was well known for writing a column in the Wallaceburg Courier Press and previous iterations of that paper, and for contributing to the Wallaceburg Museum. And Ariel is still alive, and she has contributed to both Sombra Museum and continues to serve at Wallaceburg Museum. So Maud, in conclusion, was a legend of Lambton because she promoted the history and culture of Sombra Township, and she instilled that love of learning in many, many people, her students and her children, and they've continued on her legacy of learning to this day. And a note as well in the photograph we have here is Maud in her later days in the 1980s at a photography exhibit showing off some of the museum's items. And any mistakes in the information were completely mine. I've pulled from the documents in our collection and online. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this story about the life of Maud Dio Dalgetty.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. She's such a fascinating legacy. I also see in the chat, we have people from all over Ontario joining us tonight. So that is so cool to see. And thank you for joining us. So next up is the next oil baron Aaron wanted to share tonight was John Henry Fairbank. First lured to oil springs as a land surveyor, Fairbank got interested in petroleum and established his oil business. He was an enterprising businessman who not only devised the jerker line system, which improved efficiency by hitching several wells up on one power source, meaning he could run up to 90 wells off of one boiler and 2 engines. Fairbank also moved to Petrolia when these wells started to be developed. In Petrolia, he expanded his business from just oil production. Along with business partners, he started the town's first bank, Van Tile and Fairbank hardware store, the Crown Savings and Loan Company, and he helped build the spur line from the train depot in Wyoming to Petrolia. He even entered politics. He's generally regarded as the town's benevolent patriarch. So our next presenter is David McLean, representing the Forest Museum. David is a retired high school history teacher who taught for 31 years and is currently a volunteer with the Forest Museum and the Plimpton, Wyoming Museum. He holds an honors BA in history from Huron College and a Bachelor of Education from Althouse Teachers College. All yours, David.
Thank you, Nicole, and good evening to everyone. So I'll just get my screen up here. I'm enjoying hearing all of these presentations tonight. Quite a variety of personalities. Okay, so for my presentation, I've chosen to share about the life of Howard Fraley, one of Lambton County's most famous farmers. Thomas Howard Fraley was born in St. Mary's, Ontario on June 23rd, 1877, to Sidney and Bessie Fraley. Sidney was a druggist in St. Mary's, but also operated a farm near the town. So that is where Howard, as he was known, developed his love of agriculture. Now, Howard Fraley arrived in Lambton County by about 1885, when he was about 18 years old or so, and worked for his uncle, his mother's brother, Duncan Weir, at Weir's Flax Mill in Thetford. Now, it's my understanding that this is a flax mill in Thetford that you see, these buildings, which apparently were later used by the farmerettes. If you know the story of the farmerettes, young ladies that worked in local farm farmers' fields during the Second World War. But I'm not 100% certain this is the Weir flax mill, but it very well may be. So anyways, Duncan Weir had also established a flax mill in Forest, located just on the north end of town here, on 3 acres of land. On the bottom left, to orientate you here, that's the Canadian Legion, Branch 176. And just out of sight off up to the right would be Beechwood Cemetery, just to give you an idea where this plot of land was, where the originally the Weir flour mill, or not flour, but flax mill was located. So in 1897, Weir sold the mill to Howard's father, who soon turned over the operation of the business to his son, Howard. And this is an image of a postcard that the Fraley business put out. On the right, which is the back of the postcard, they've provided illustrations of some of their product. And on the left, you can see an image of the flax mill. It's kind of hard to make it out there. So if you're familiar with Mona Huckworth's book on the history of forest, in there is an artist has done a rendition, I guess, of the flax mill operation. So you can see the flax mill in the middle, a flax barn off to the left, horse stables, and I presume the flax fields were just beyond there in the image. So anyways, at the time he took over running the mill in Forest, there were only 15 flax mills in the country. The Fraley flax mill would operate continuously for 38 years, the only mill in North America with such a record. In the year of 1900, Fraley sold and shipped 152,000 pounds of flax tow. And in 1902, a new flax barn was built and wired with electricity to make it one of the best equipped mills in Canada. On the personal side of his life, Fraley married Forest resident Winifred Bell Anderson. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a photo of her. In 1901, in the following year, a son was born to them named Sidney, after Howard's father. Sidney is a very popular name in the Fraley family. The family lived in a large 2-story house on Albert Street, not far from the mill. So that's the house you see on the left. Now, the house on the right is familiar to many people in town here as the Fraley House, located on King Street. And it's often called that because the Fraleys did live there for several generations. But the second owner of the building was Duncan Weir, actually, so Howard's uncle. And after his passing, Howard and his mother took possession of the home. So despite a devastating fire at the mill in 1907, as reported in the article on the left here, Fraley managed to rebuild and get his business back in operation within a month. And this is a new building that was built as part of the new mill. So on the screen here, I've provided you an image on the right. This is not from around here, but this is what the fields of flax in the area would have looked like. It must have been beautiful to look out on a field like that. You can see the gorgeous blue flowers of the flax plant over on the left here. And in our museum collection, on the left, you see the head of a bunch of flax that's in our possession, which, as far as I know, did come from the Fraley farm. It's very fragile. I've had to move it very delicately. In front of it are some strands of processed fiber, flax fiber. On the right, some flax seed, also in our possession. Now, the image that you see up here on the screen is from an old postcard. And it's fascinating because this shows one of the Fraley fields. And these men they've cut the flax in the field, and they're beginning the process of dew redding. And that's mentioned here at the bottom of the screen on the postcard, dew redding, D-E-W, redding, which involved basically laying, they did have tanks of water out in the field too, I guess. But some moisture is important here. It was basically a process of letting the flax lay in the field and more or less rot to break down the fairly tough outer portion of the stem of the flax to get at the fiber inside. Okay, so that's called dew redding. And here the men are apparently turning the flax. They apparently periodically had to go out and turn it over. And this is also a postcard from the time period. It's fascinating because it shows inside the Fraley mill. And this is a process of scutching, as it's called here, and it's to go beyond what nature did. Here in the mill, these men would be removing the seeds and all the non-desirable parts of the plant to get at the fiber. Okay, so that's what's going on there. That was called scutching. And I came across this image, which is nice, on the internet. You can see flax seeds on the left, basically the raw plant next to it there, and then the broken flax, so it's gone through the retting process, the scutch flax, and then the combed flax. And on the right, a sample of linen fabric. So that is a product that would be made from flax, would be linen, and linseed oil was made from the flax seeds. Okay. Well, in 1914, war broke out in Europe, and Howard Fraley was recruited to oversee the gathering and processing of all flax produced in Canada to be shipped overseas. The British government had contacted the Canadian government, and so that's how this came about. And Fraley was recruited to process all the flax right here in Forest for Canada that would be shipped over to Britain. And where it was sent was over to Ireland for the most part, to the Irish linen mills. And this is one here, and this is the interior of an Irish linen mill. Ireland had a long history of processing flax into linen. And why did they need it for the war? Well, it's because of the new weapon of war, aircraft. Okay, these had a very different construction compared to aircraft, of course, today, which are heavily metal. These are mostly wooden structures, and the linen was used to help cover the aircraft wings due to its strength and relative lightness. And it was coated with a cellulose lacquer, which made the fabric impervious to air and water. So many of the aircraft flown by the Royal Flying Corps pilots in the First World War, including by Canadian pilots like Billy Bishop, as you see here, were made with linen covering the wings from flax that originally was processed through forest. Okay, that's quite remarkable to think about. Not all the flax was grown here, but it was processed through here and sent overseas. So Howard Fraley went on to experiment with a variety of agricultural products, including hemp. The growing of hemp had a long history going back to ancient times, and had been used, and still is, of course, for a variety of purposes, including paper, clothing, and rope. In 1917, Howard Fraley headed down to Kentucky. He heard some success, I guess, there growing hemp for commercial uses. And so he grabbed some seeds, came back to Canada, and planted 13 acres for his first crop. And he processed the hemp fiber in his flax mill. And by 1926, he was growing 150 acres just outside of town here. And in 1927, he's a very inventive person. Fraley invented a machine for converting hemp into fiber. And then he would send his fiber to mills elsewhere to get the spinning of it done. So during his life, and here's some men harvesting the hemp, and yeah, there's an image with Howard staying in the middle, with a couple of other gentlemen with his crop there. So during his life, Howard Fraley made contacts with many persons of prominence in agriculture and industry, and none more notable, perhaps, than Henry Ford, who you see on the right. Ford was always on the lookout for new ideas and products to incorporate into his manufacture of automobiles. And at some point, he connected with Howard Fraley, and apparently Ford visited Forest, and Fraley went down to visit Ford in Dearborn, Michigan there. And in 1941, this is quite remarkable, Henry Ford had a car built made from hemp, flax, wheat, and spruce pulp, which made the car lighter than fiberglass and 10 times tougher than steel, according to the New York Times at the time. The car ran on ethanol made from hemp or other agricultural waste. And Ford's experimental model was deemed a step forward toward the realization of his dream to, quote, grow automobiles from soil, wrote Popular Mechanics in their December 1941 issue. And what became of this, I don't know if I know the whole story here, but apparently, well, during World War II, the production of automobiles was pretty much shut down. So they could produce what the tanks and everything else needed for the war effort. And this project came to an end as far as I know. Besides, oh, and just a little footnote here. I'm aware that a local gentleman who was a fiddle player by the name of Del Coulter apparently came to Ford's attention and frequently performed down for Ford and his guests down there in Dearborn. Besides his experimentation with various crops, Howard Fraley had an interest in livestock farming, particularly beef cattle, and his Aberdeen Angus was specially bred to withstand the Canadian climate. In those days, a lot of cattle were kept in barns for much of their lives, and Fraley was a proponent of getting them out, getting them in the fields, and he bred these Aberdeen Angus specifically to withstand our climate here. And he won numerous prizes at agricultural exhibitions for his cattle. Due to the prominence he achieved in his agricultural and business endeavors, Howard Fraley was encouraged to run for political office and was elected as a Conservative MPP for Lambton East in the Ontario legislature, a seat he held until 1934. During his term in office, Fraley served as an advisor to the Minister of Agriculture, but it's funny, he was known as the man of few words, and apparently he never gave a speech in the legislature. He let other people do the talking, I guess. He was more of a behind-the-scenes politician. So in 1930, Fraley handed over operation of his flax mill to his son, Sidney. In 1938, the federal government forbade the growing of hemp under the Opium and Drug Act, forcing Fraley to shut down his operation. Despite his protests that his crop was used strictly for commercial and industrial purposes and not narcotics. I had somebody come to the museum one time and said to me, you would have to have smoked an entire field of hemp in order to get any kind of high from it. I don't know the truth behind that, but that's what was said. So Howard Fraley passed away in 1946 after a lifetime of profound influence on agriculture in Canada. So thanks very much. And just before I go there, I think this may be mentioned later. This is our 2025 museum calendar, which is now currently available for purchase. So just contact us at the museum if you would like your own copy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That's a fascinating history. So to introduce our final oil field legend of the night, it's going to be Jacob Engelhart, who's only 19 years old when he opened his refinery in London, Ontario, after moving to Canada from New York in the late 1870s. Engelhart moved to Petrolia and he set up the Silver Star Refinery after receiving a 5-year tax relief deal from the town. In 1880, Engelhart led the formation of the 16 oilmen coming together to create Imperial Oil Company Limited in an attempt to keep the American Standard Oil out of Canada. Engelhart married Charlotte Eleanor Thompson in 1891, and they built the Glenview Mansion and a golf course beside it. In her will, Charlotte would turn over the house to the town for use as a hospital, which it still stands today. In 1905, Engelhart moved to the railway industry and took over the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway. So these 4 oil field legends each had their start from humble means and developed into a great personal fortune. They did much to build the new history whose global reach is undeniable. And with that last legend, I will be our last presenter of the night. So I've been working at the Lambton County Archives since 2018, and prior to that, I was the curator at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology. My educational background, I have a Bachelor of Honors in Classical Archaeology from Laurier University and a postgraduate Museum and Gallery Studies from Georgian College. And I just recently completed an Executive Master of Business Administration, specializing in innovation leadership from the University of Fredericton. So now I gotta figure out sharing my screen here. I'm gonna share that, and I'm gonna open that. And we are going to talk about Marie Prevost this evening. So Marie Prevost was born in Sarnia to Mary Bickford Dunn on November 6, 1896, to Arthur, Teddy, and Hughina MacDonald Dunn. In 1897, her father, who was a railway conductor, was one of 6 men killed in a tragic accident in the St. Clair Tunnel, rail tunnel by fumes from a steam locomotive, so it was carbon monoxide. Marie's mother, shortly thereafter, married Frank Prevost in 1899, who was a traveling salesman, and the family moved around to the US until they eventually settled in Los Angeles around 1910, where Mary found work as a stenographer. Mary was discovered at the age of 18 when she was visiting a movie set in Hollywood, being mistaken for an actress and put onto the scene. Mac Sennett, who was a director at the time, spotted Marie's natural comedic ability and signed her up for $15 a week. She became one of his bathing beauties. So these were silent film starlets that he often cast in many of his films. One of her publicly successful film roles came in the 1920 romantic film Love, Honor, and Behave, opposite another newcomer and Senate protege, George O'Hara. Initially cast in numerous minor comedic roles as a beautiful and innocent young girl, she worked in several films for Senate Studio until 1921 when she signed with Universal Studios. At Universal, she received a great deal of publicity and was featured in numerous publicity events. After movie producer Irving Thalberg announced that he had selected 2 films for Prevost to star in, The Moonlight Follies and Kissed, Thalberg sent Prevost to Coney Island, where she publicly burned her bathing suit to symbolize the end of her bathing beauty days. Between her time as a bathing beauty and as a silent film actress at Universal, she appeared in over 120 films and was one of Hollywood's brightest stars for most of the 1920s, earning over $1,500 per week at that time. Her personal life, however, was not as successful. Her first marriage was to socialite Sonny Girk at the start of her career in 1918, and they kept the marriage a secret, divorcing in 1923, citing desertion. Her second marriage was to Kenneth Harlan in 1924 on the set of The Beautiful and the Damned, where they co-starred. They lived in a large mansion in Beverly Hills, which is featured on this slide here. And they lived there until their marriage ended in 1929. It was the tragic death of her mother in early 1926 in a car accident when Marie fell into a deep depression, resulting in her drinking very heavily. By the end of 1926, she was let go from Warner Brothers and lost leading lady status. Her depression, coupled with drinking, caused her to gain actually quite a bit of weight, and she ended up losing even more movie roles. And so she began crash dieting to keep whatever she was able to get. By that time, she did start making a comeback in the talkies, and it was shortly before her death that she was starting to be featured in films again. That said, she did unfortunately pass away in 1937 with only $300 to her name. The listed cause for her death was alcoholism and malnutrition. Her fate, however, did prompt Hollywood to create the motion picture and television country house and hospital to provide medical care to anyone, whether you were behind the scenes, a set designer, you could be running the cameras, an actress, actor, whomever, to provide the medical care for people in the entertainment industry. In 1960, she also received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in honor of her numerous contributions to the film industry at that time. So that is my short presentation for tonight. And that concludes the formal presentations. So who really knew we had so many amazing people connected to Lambton County? If you have any questions, now is the time to submit them in the Q&A box while I read a few updates from our community museums across Lambton County. So to start, Forest Museum is hosting a Christmas open house this Saturday from 10 to 3 p.m. Christmas pots and decor and the 2025 museum calendar will be on sale. Lambton Heritage Museum's winter hours are Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday from 11 to 4 and Thursdays from 11 to 8:30 p.m. If you're looking for unique holiday gifts, stop by the gift shop. You will find branded mugs, old-time children's toys, books on local topics for kids and adults, artwork from local artists, and adorable stuffed plushies featuring the beloved museum cat, Jack. Also consider giving the gift of a museum membership this season. Family memberships are $30 and individual memberships are $20. Lastly, get ready for some holiday cheer at the Oil Museum gift shop. Now until October 30th, 2024, enjoy 10% off books and puzzles and a fantastic 20% off regular priced museum souvenir items. It's the perfect time to find that special gift while exploring the unique selection. From hot sauce to an oil field ornament and local history books to oil museum doodle mugs and magnets, there is something for everyone. Now, we have had some questions come throughout the duration of the presentations, and I do see we've had some more come in now. So there was one earlier about the Pesha photographs and how many were in the Lambton County Archives and Museum collections. Kaylin did mention that Sombra has about 100 Pesha photos. Dana, how many would you say the Heritage Museum has?
It's a good question. And one of the really nice thing about Pesha postcards was that they actually say Pesha on them, and he had a numbering system as well. So you can look at the postcard and know right away that it's a Pesha. Off the top of my head, I'd say we have maybe 250 or 300 Pesha postcards in our collection, and they are some of the best scenes of Lambton County. So they really are a treasure.
And we have quite a few in the archives collection as well, and they're all interspersed depending on the type of, like if it's a ship, if it's a landscape, if it's buildings. So they are quite stunning. Another question that came in, Greg, are you able to expand on that hemp connection that I think you mentioned in the chat?
Oh, I was merely making connection that McBride started off as an inspector of linens, so the flax industry in Ireland, and the Fraleys were engaged, obviously, in flax for linen purposes. So I just thought it's a tenuous connection, but nonetheless.
It's still a connection. That's so neat. Is there any more questions?
Nicole?
Yes.
I know there was a question that came in asking how to connect with the museums. I went and typed an answer and didn't realize that would cut off the answer. So I gave our museum's email address there, but I don't know if the other museums here want to provide any contact information.
I think I'm frozen.
We can hear you.
Okay. I just got everybody back. My internet connection is unstable currently. Got the first bit of your answer, David, but I totally missed the last. But there is thank you in there as well. Well, I don't see any other questions. So I think I will say on behalf of the Heritage Sarnia-Lambton Museum Network, thank you everyone for attending tonight and continuing to support your local museums. Your support is critical in allowing us to continue preserving and sharing our local history and stories of the community, and we look forward to seeing you at our sites. Until next time, thank you.
Thank you.